Welcome to Marco's Paper's Top 12 Christmas Favorites 2013. Today, Chris and I are going to look at stencils. I'm going to talk you through a couple of the Tim Holtz layering stencils, and then she has some others that she'll show you. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a card front with these stencils. I have already added gelatos to my background. I've used the cotton candy as well as the metallic blueberry. One of the techniques we showed in the gelato videos: when you color, scribble on your sheet, spritz with water, turn your paper over, and then you get your nice colored background. So that's how I got my background on this. The next step is to add another layer, and we are going to use the Tim Holtz Star stencil, and I'm also going to use distress paint. This is actually antique linen, and when I use distress paint on my stencils, I either put it directly onto my sponge. I do use cut and dry sponge to go through the stencil. That way the paint isn't too thick or heavy and you don't get too much seep underneath your stencil. And I will just dab into my paint to get a fairly thin layer, pounce my stencil for this particular technique, and I will get my stars. It takes a little bit more paint sometimes than I think. So we'll just continue dab, get some on your sponge, go ahead and create your stars. When I use a stencil, I don't use the whole stencil. I will just use portions of it so it doesn't look just like somebody laid a stencil down on your paper. If you use portions, kind of fade in and out, that gives it a little more depth and you don't get those straight lines that are not really terribly appealing. So when I lift this up, you will sort of be able to see, because I use the antique linen, it has a little bit of color to it. So you can see those a little bit. Now we will dry this with my handy dandy industrial heat gun. Thank you, assistant. Now that the paint's dry, we can go on to our next layer of stenciling. And for that one, I'm going to use the Schoolhouse stencil from Tim Holtz again, and this time I'm going to use distress ink. I'm going to use my ink pad, and I will position my stencil off to the side a little bit here. And I like my stencil to run over the edge, so I don't necessarily have full coverage. And then once again we'll pounce. In some areas I will get it a little bit darker. In other areas I'll just go over it a little more lightly so it's not as defined. And you'll see we end up with 2 layers of our stencil. The paint does act as a resist for the distress ink. And what you can do is just this is a damp baby wipe, and you can just wipe over your stars and remove the distress ink. If the ink, and actually, well, the ink, before the ink dries, you can also take your baby wipe and tone down. If you want to tone down just a little bit, so perhaps getting a bit more of a fade here is more attractive than a straight line, so you can fade your edges. So that's just a quick sample of a way to use a couple of the layering stencils together to create a background. And I have taken that same background. What I did on this was I took my broken china, I went ahead and I edged with my distress ink. Then I took a piece of the seam binding ribbon and turned my ink pad over, put some ink on my mat, spritzed it, and ran my ribbon through the ink, so I was able to color my ribbon with the same color that I'd been using for my edges. The trees are some things we had cut out earlier. I taped one down pop dotted the other, added a little bit of stickles, and then just for fun took some of the Christmas remnant rubs, and they come in 2 colors. You get 1 sheet of white and 1 sheet of black. So I rubbed several of the different Christmas words in white for the background, and then I wanted the Merry Christmas to stand out, to be more bold, and so I used black so that one would stand out. And here is another background example. This is actually distress paint background, and I've used the stencil, the schoolhouse stencil again with distress paint on this background, and then some stamping with the distress paint. So you can see you can layer the stencils with stamps. This is also a text stamp. So there's all different kinds of ways you can use your stencils. Chris has a couple examples that she's going to show us now.
Okay, the stencil I'm going to use today is one of Wendy Vecchi's stencils, and she also has some new ink colors that she's teamed up with Ranger. And I'm just using a file folder, just cut a square for my card base, and I'm going to tape my stencil down. And as Debbie liked to use her stencil off the edge of her project, I'm going to do the same thing. And I'm going to tape off just that stem there so I don't get anything extra at that point. And I'm going to use the darker red first, red geranium. And right in the center, you can pounce for a light color, or you can rub that cut and dry foam and get a darker color there in the center. And then the orange blossom. And you get a little bit of shading using 2 different colors. So there we have our flower. I'm going to tape off a little bit of that. Again, have my stem come off to the side. And I believe that color is fern green. And I did get a little bit of the orange up here, and we're going to cover that up in just a minute here. We're going to add some distress ink on our background. Whoops. Get it all set up here. And I'm going to start with my lighter scattered straw, and I like to blend from the edges in a circular motion, starting off my craft mat so you don't get a real harsh line. And what's nice about these archival inks is they are permanent, and so the color is not going to be affected by these distress inks. And we can also use water, which we're going to use in just a minute here. But these distress inks blend very nicely. They are a dye ink, but they are a little slower in drying so that you can get a nice blend of color and a nice background. And we'll end with the frayed burlap. And I'm just going to touch the edges up. These out of the way. And a unique thing with these inks, I'm going to stamp with water. That out of the way. Just do a little mist. and take a little bit off with my paper towel. And hopefully you'll be able to see how the distress inks react. The water just kind of moves the ink out of the way as it dries. Hopefully it looks good in person, trust me. But that's a neat thing you can do. And also, if you want a little bit more water, you can actually just drip on your background and get some nice splotches of. And again, that permanent ink does not move. Only the distress will react. And then here's the finished card. Did a little bit of just partial stamping just to add some texture to that background.
So there you have it, a couple different ways to use stencils. The Tim Holtz layering stencils on this card, and then on Chris's card she used the Wendy Vecchi stencils. Hope you whip out your stencils, make some art.